The wind that came through Granite Pass in the autumn of 1887 was the kind that found every gap in the chinking and made the lard pail rattle on its hook all night. It was not the worst wind Dorothea Calloway had ever known. She had known worse in Missouri in the winter of '61 when the snow came sideways for 3 days, and her father's cattle froze standing up in the north pasture. But this wind was persistent in a way that felt personal, as though the mountain itself had taken offense at the small square cabin, sitting on its shelf of land, and was trying night after night to convince the people inside that they did not belong. Thea, as everyone called her, was 64 years old. She had been 62 when she arrived in Montana Territory, stepping off the stage at Granite Pass with a trunk of seed tin and a composed expression that her husband Silas later admitted had unnerved him considerably. She had looked at the shelf of land between the two granite ridges, and she had looked at the small cabin Silas had built 3 years earlier from lodgepole pine. He dragged 3 miles on a borrowed mule, and she had said, "It will do." She did not say it unkindly. She said it the way a woman says something when she has already made her calculations and found the sum acceptable, even if the individual numbers were not what she might have chosen. Silas Calloway, who was 66 then and is 68 now, understood this about his wife. He understood that she was not a woman who complained about circumstances. She was a woman who assessed them, adapted to them, and then quietly set about changing the ones that could be changed. The cabin sat 40 miles from the nearest town of any consequence. The soil on the shelf was thin and stubborn, and Silas grew oats and kitchen vegetables, with results that varied from disappointing to merely adequate. The oat yield was poor most years. The kitchen garden required hauling creek water, 50 yards uphill through the summer months, and Thea made that walk twice a day with 2 buckets balanced on a yoke across her shoulders, her boots wearing a path in the sparse grass that never quite grew back. There was a small income from trapping in the winter, and from selling cured hides to the trading post at Granite Pass, but it was a narrow living. Both of them knew it. The nearest neighbor was the Pruitt family 2 miles south, who grew wheat on better ground, and were not shy about mentioning it. Hector Pruitt was a decent man, but his wife Martha had a way of looking at Thea's kitchen garden that communicated more than any words could about what she thought of people who tried to farm granite. Life on the shelf was not hard in the breaking kind of way. It was hard in the wearing kind of way, which is sometimes worse. A breaking hardship comes all at once, and you either survive it or you do not. And either way, there is an end to it. A wearing hardship comes slowly day after day, small failures accumulating like dust on a windowsill, until one morning you look around and realize that everything you own is covered in a fine gray film of disappointment. Thea had known both kinds of hardship in her 64 years. She had buried 2 children in Missouri before they were old enough to walk. She had watched her first husband die of fever in the summer of '58, holding his hand while the life went out of him over the course of 3 days. And she had kept the farm running alone for 6 years after that, before selling it and answering Silas Calloway's advertisement for a wife. The advertisement had been brief and honest. Widower 64 with land in Montana Territory seeks practical woman for partnership. No romantics, hard work required. Thea had appreciated the lack of pretense. She had written back with equal brevity. Widow 62 from Missouri. Practical. Not afraid of work. When should I arrive? They had been married by a circuit preacher 3 days after she stepped off the stage, and in the 2 years since, neither of them had found cause to regret the arrangement. They were not romantic people. They were people who understood that a good partnership was worth more than a passionate one, and that respect accumulated interest over time in ways that infatuation never did. Their son, Thomas, had arrived 6 months after Thea, bringing his wife, Prudence, with him. Thomas was Silas's boy from his first marriage, a quiet man of 36, who had injured his leg in a logging accident and could no longer do the heavy work that had been his livelihood. Prue, as everyone called her, was 34, and had the kind of quick mind that Thea recognized immediately as an asset. She kept the household accounts and could calculate sums in her head faster than most men could work them on paper. The four of them lived in the cabin together, which was close quarters but manageable. Thomas and Prue slept in the loft. Silas and Thea had the bed by the hearth. There was a rhythm to their days that had the comfort of predictability, even if the tune itself was not particularly cheerful. And then October came and the wind came with it. And Thea Calloway found a crack in the granite wall that changed everything. She found it on a Saturday morning, the 14th of October, though she did not know then that she would remember the date for the rest of her life. She had been walking the eastern edge of the property, as she often did in the early morning hours before anyone else was awake. It was her time to think, to observe, to notice the things that other people walk past without seeing. Thea had always been a finder. It was not a skill she had cultivated so much as a quality she had been born with, like the color of her eyes, or the particular way her left knee ached before a rainstorm. She found things. A bird's nest in the woodpile every spring, a Spanish real coin in the creek bed that turned out to be worth $3 at the trading post. Frogs under flat rocks and odd-shaped pieces of quartz that she kept in a row on the windowsill, not because they were valuable, but because they pleased her. Silas said she had a diviner's eye. Thea said she was simply patient in a way that most people were not. Most people looked at the world and saw only what they expected to see. Thea looked at the world and saw what was actually there, which was often quite different. On this particular morning, she was looking at the granite wall that formed the eastern boundary of their property. It was an imposing formation rising perhaps 40 feet above the shelf, where the cabin sat, a solid mass of gray stone that had been there since before human memory, and would be there long after everyone currently alive had turned to dust. Thea had walked past it hundreds of times in the 2 years since she arrived. She had never given it more than a passing glance. But on this morning, something caught her attention. The crack was narrow, perhaps 18 inches at its widest point, running vertically from about knee height to well above her head. 7 feet tall in its tallest reach, though the width was irregular, wider in the middle than at the top or bottom. It was the kind of gap that could have been there forever without anyone noticing, just another feature of the rock face, unremarkable and easy to overlook. Thea did not know why she stopped. She did not know why she reached out and pressed her palm flat against the stone just below the opening. But when she did, she felt something that made her breath catch in her throat. Warmth. Not the warmth of stone that has been sitting in the sun. The morning was gray and overcast, and the rock face was in shadow. The stone under her palm should have been cold as the air around her, as cold as the ground beneath her feet. But it was not. It was warm. She stood very still. She was a woman who had learned long ago not to react quickly to unexpected things. Quick reactions led to quick mistakes, and Thea Calloway did not make quick mistakes. She made slow, deliberate decisions based on careful observation. And if those decisions sometimes came too late, at least they were rarely wrong. She moved her hand higher to the edge of the crack itself and felt the air that was coming from inside the opening. It was faint, a gentle current rather than a breeze, but it was unmistakably there. And it was warm, warmer than the air around her, warm in a way that had no explanation she could think of. Standing in the October morning with frost still on the ground and her breath making small clouds in front of her face. There was a smell, too. Something mineral and damp, like the air near a creek before you can see the water. Like hot springs she had heard about, but never visited places where the earth itself leaked heat, and the water came up steaming from underground. She leaned closer to the crack and breathed in deeply. The smell was stronger now, mineral and clean and somehow alive in a way that rock should not be alive. Thea stepped back and looked at the crack for a long moment. She looked at it the way she looked at everything that surprised her, which was to say with careful attention and absolutely no expression on her face. Then she turned and walked back to the cabin to find Silas. He did not believe her at first. This did not offend Thea because she was not entirely sure she believed herself. Warm air coming from a crack in solid granite was not something that fit neatly into any category of experience she possessed, and she was not a woman who made claims without evidence. "Come and feel it yourself," she said. Silas was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he looked over the accounts from the trading post. Thomas was still in the loft, sleeping late because his leg had been paining him the night before. Prue was at the stove stirring a pot of oats that would be their breakfast. "Feel what?" Silas asked. "The crack in the east wall. There is warm air coming out of it." Silas looked at her with the expression of a man who has learned that his wife is usually right, but is not yet ready to abandon his skepticism entirely. Warm air. Yes. From the rock. From a crack in the rock. I am not asking you to believe me, Silas. I am asking you to come and verify what I have observed. Silas set down his cup and pushed back from the table. He had been married to Thea long enough to know that she did not make observations lightly, and that when she asked him to verify something, it was because she had already verified it herself and wanted a second opinion. They walked together to the east wall, Thea leading the way along the path she had worn with her morning walks. The sky was still gray, and the wind had not yet picked up to its usual daytime strength. The crack was exactly as she had left it, a narrow vertical gap in the stone that could have been there for 1,000 years without anyone thinking twice about it. "Here," Thea said, and pressed her hand to the stone beside the crack. Silas pressed his own hand to the rock face. He frowned. The stone was cool as he had expected it to be. "Not the stone," Thea said. "The air. Put your face to the gap and breathe." Silas gave her a look that suggested he was humoring her, but he bent forward and put his face close to the crack. He breathed in. The frown disappeared. Something else replaced it. Something that Thea recognized because she had felt it herself 20 minutes earlier. Surprise. Genuine surprise, the kind that comes when the world presents you with something that does not fit your understanding of how things work. "What do you smell?" Thea asked. Silas breathed in again, slower this time. "Water," he said. "Warm water. Something mineral-like." He trailed off, searching for the comparison. "Like a hot spring," Thea said. "Yes." Silas straightened up and looked at the crack with new eyes. He looked at it the way a man looks at a locked door when he realizes there might be a key. It could be a cavity in the rock, a small pocket of air. It might not amount to anything. It might not, Thea agreed. Could be quite small. Could be quite large. They stood there for a moment, both of them looking at the gap in the granite, neither of them moving away. "It could be a danger," Silas said finally. "Bad air deeper in. A drop-off. We do not know what is in there." "We do not," Thea said. "Probably nothing." Probably. But neither of them moved. There was a practical argument against investigating further. They had wood to split and a harness to mend and a half-finished letter to Thea's cousin in Missouri that had been sitting on the table for a week. A gap in a rock face was not a task on any list, and Silas was a man who worked from lists. He had been that way his whole life, methodical and steady, tackling one job at a time in the order of its importance. And yet, the warmth of that air against his face, the smell of it mineral and living and entirely out of place in that granite wall. It had lodged in him the way a splinter lodges under the skin, impossible to ignore, even when you cannot see it. Thea watched him wrestling with himself and said nothing. She understood the struggle because she was having it herself. 64 years of practicality told her to walk away, to focus on the tasks that needed doing, to not waste time on what was probably nothing. But 64 years of finding things told her something else. Told her that the world sometimes offered gifts to the people who were patient enough to look for them, and that walking away from this crack without knowing what was inside would haunt her for whatever years she had left. "Tomorrow," Silas said finally, "I will trim the lantern wick tonight, and we will have a look in the morning. If it is nothing, it is nothing." "If it is nothing, it is nothing," Thea agreed. But she did not believe it was nothing. She did not know what it was, but she knew in her bones that it was something. And she was not willing to wait until tomorrow to find out. That night after supper, Thea sat by the fire and watched Silas trim the lantern wick. He worked carefully, as he did everything, taking his time with the task and checking his work twice before setting the lantern aside. Thomas and Prue had gone up to the loft early, tired from the day's work, and the cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the ever-present moan of the wind outside. "You are thinking about the crack," Silas said without looking up. "Yes." "You have been thinking about it all evening." Thea did not deny it. There was no point in denying things to Silas that he could see perfectly well for himself. "I keep asking myself why I never noticed it before," she said. "I have walked past that wall every morning for 2 years. I have looked at it hundreds of times. How did I never see the crack?" Silas set down the lantern and looked at her. "You said yourself that it could have been there forever. We see what we expect to see. A rock wall is a rock wall. Why would anyone look closely at it? I am someone who looks closely at things. That is what I do. I find things that other people miss, and I missed this for 2 years. Perhaps it was not there to be found until now." Thea considered this. It was not a rational explanation, and she was a rational woman. But she had lived long enough to know that rationality did not account for everything. There were currents in the world that ran deeper than logic patterns that revealed themselves only when the time was right. She had felt it before in small ways. The sense that a particular moment was significant, that a particular choice would echo forward into the future in ways she could not yet see. She felt it now looking at the firelight dancing on the cabin walls. "I have a feeling," she said slowly, "that tomorrow will matter. That what we find in that crack will change something." Silas did not dismiss this. He was not a superstitious man, but he had been married to Thea long enough to respect her intuitions. "For better or worse?" he asked. "I do not know, but I think I have been waiting for it. I think, without knowing what I was waiting for, I have been waiting for something ever since I arrived here. And I think this might be it." The fire popped. The wind pushed at the cabin walls. Outside in the darkness, the granite wall stood as it had stood for thousands of years, keeping its secrets behind a narrow crack that no one had thought to look through until now. They went in the morning, the three of them. Thomas stayed behind because his leg was troubling him. But Prue came along curious about the crack her mother-in-law had described at breakfast. The morning was cold and clear, the first real cold of the autumn, with frost thick on the ground and ice at the edges of the creek. Silas carried the lantern and the coiled rope he had packed without being asked. Thea walked beside him with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Prue followed a few steps behind her, breath making white clouds in the still air. The crack was exactly as they had left it the day before. Unremarkable, easy to overlook. Just a narrow gap in the granite 7 feet tall, and barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. Silas lit the lantern and adjusted the flame until it burned clean and bright. He looked at the crack, then at Thea, then at the crack again. "I will go first," he said. "Test the footing and the air." "No," Thea said. Silas turned to look at her. "No, I found it. I will go first." There was a silence. Prue watched the two of them with the expression of a woman who knows better than to get involved in a conversation that does not include her. "Thea," Silas said carefully, "you are 64 years old. I am aware of my age. The passage could be difficult, narrow. There could be places where you would need to climb or squeeze through tight spaces, or I am aware of what a passage through rock might involve. I am simply saying that it would be more practical for me to—" "Silas." Thea's voice was quiet but firm. 64 years I have lived, and in 64 years I have walked past more cracks than I can count, because I assumed there was nothing inside them worth seeing. I've let other people go first because it was more practical, more sensible, more appropriate for a woman of my age and station. I have been practical my entire life. She paused, looking at the dark gap in the granite. "This time," she said, "I am going first." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he handed her the lantern. "The rope," he said. "If it goes deeper than we can see, tie it around your waist. I will hold the other end." Thea took the lantern. The weight of it was familiar in her hand. the glass warm from the flame inside. She looked at the crack one more time, at the narrow slice of darkness that led into the mountain's heart. Then she stepped forward and let the stone receive her. The passage was narrow. That was her first clear thought as she edged sideways into the gap, the lantern held before her in one hand, the fingers of her other hand trailing along the cool stone wall. The rock pressed against her chest and her back simultaneously, and for a moment she felt a flutter of panic, the ancient fear of being trapped, of being buried, of the weight of the mountain coming down on her. She breathed, slow and steady the way she had learned to breathe through difficult things. The panic subsided. The passage ran straight back into the mountain, angling slightly to the left. The floor was uneven but solid, and she tested each step before committing her weight to it, just as Silas would have done. The lantern light pushed back the darkness perhaps 10 feet ahead of her, and beyond that there was nothing but black. She heard Silas behind her, his shoulders scraping against the stone as he followed. She heard Prue's lighter footsteps behind him. The sounds echoed strangely in the confined space, multiplied and distorted by the rock. 20 feet in the passage began to widen. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that she could walk without her shoulders touching both walls. The air grew warmer as she went deeper, and the mineral smell grew stronger. She could hear something now, too. A sound so faint that at first she thought she was imagining it. A whisper, a trickle, the voice of water moving over stone. 30 feet. The passage curved to the left and she followed it. The lantern held high. The warm air wrapped around her like a blanket, pushing back the cold of the October morning she had left behind. 40 feet. She came around the curve and stopped. The lantern nearly fell from her hand. The space that opened before her was impossible. That was her first thought, the word that filled her mind before any other: impossible. There was no way this could exist here, inside the granite ridge that she had walked past every day for 2 years. There was no way she could be seeing what she was seeing. And yet, the basin was roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet across at its widest point. The ceiling rose above her in a series of fractured granite slabs, laid against each other at angles, and through the gaps between those slabs, light filtered down. Real light. Daylight. Thin and indirect, coming from somewhere above, where the fissures in the rock reached all the way to the surface. It was not bright. It was not like standing outside on a clear morning. But it was enough that the space had a luminosity of its own, a soft gray glow that mixed with the yellow light of her lantern and made the whole chamber feel like something from a dream. The floor of the basin was uneven granite with several shallow depressions, and one long flat stretch that might with work accommodate a pair of bedrolls comfortably. Along the northern wall, the rock had been worked at by water and time into a series of deep ledges, natural shelves between 18 inches and 3 feet deep, each one roughly level. And along the eastern wall, running in a thin, bright ribbon down the stone, was water. Thea walked toward it slowly, her footsteps echoing in the space. The water wept from a horizontal crack in the rock, perhaps 8 feet wide, flowing steadily down the stone face and collecting in a natural basin about 2 feet across and 6 inches deep, before finding its way through a lower crack in the floor and disappearing into the mountain's depths. She knelt beside the basin and put her fingers in the water. Warm. Not hot, but warm. Warm as creek water in midsummer. Warm as bath water that has been sitting for a while. Warm in a way that had no business existing in the middle of October. 40 miles from anywhere inside a mountain made of solid stone. She cupped water in her hands and brought it to her lips. She tasted iron and something else, something mineral and clean. Not unpleasant, just strong. Behind her, she heard Silas come through the passage. She heard him stop. She heard the sharp intake of his breath. "Lord Almighty," he said quietly. Thea did not turn around. She was looking at the water running down the stone, looking at the soft light filtering through the fissures above, looking at the impossible space that had been waiting inside the mountain all along. "How?" Silas asked. His voice echoed strangely in the chamber. "How is this here?" Thea did not answer immediately. She was still kneeling by the water, her fingers trailing in the warm current, her mind working through the implications of what she was seeing. Not the geological explanation, although she supposed there was one. Hot springs existed in the territory. Thermal activity beneath the Earth's surface could warm rock and water in ways that seemed like magic to people who did not understand the science. That was not what occupied her thoughts. What occupied her thoughts was simpler and more profound. This space existed. It had existed presumably for thousands of years, hidden behind a narrow crack in the granite waiting for someone to find it. And now she had found it, and everything was different. "Thea," Silas said. She looked up at him. He was standing in the entrance to the chamber, the lantern she had set down, casting his shadow, long and strange, across the stone floor. Prue was just visible behind him, her eyes wide as she took in the space. "This is ours," Thea said. "This land is ours. This rock is on our land, which means this." She gestured at the chamber around them, at the light and the water and the warm stone. "This is ours too." Silas walked slowly into the basin, turning as he went, taking in the ceiling and the walls and the natural shelves and the seep of warm water along the eastern edge. He pressed his hand against the stone and held it there for a moment, feeling the warmth that radiated from deep within the mountain. "It is warm," he said. "The stone itself is warm." "Yes. We could—" He stopped as if the thought was too large to complete. Thea stood up. Her knees protested as they always did these days, but she barely noticed. She was looking at the long, flat stretch of floor along the western wall, imagining a platform of planks raised on low legs to keep bedding off the stone. She was looking at the natural shelves along the northern wall, imagining them lined with dried meat and preserved vegetables and crocks of beans. She was looking at the warm water running endlessly down the eastern wall, imagining the buckets she would not have to carry up the hill anymore. For 3 years, Silas had been trying to make a life on this land. For 2 years, she had been helping him. And for all that time, this had been here, hidden, waiting. "We could survive here," she said quietly. "Not just survive. We could live." Prue had come into the chamber now, moving slowly along the edges, running her hands over the stone shelves. "The temperature," she said. "It must be constant. 50 degrees, maybe 55. Warmer than the cabin in winter, cooler than the cabin in summer. Yes, Thea said. You could store food here. It would keep longer than anywhere else on the property. Yes. And the water. Prue bent to touch the stream running down the eastern wall. Running water, warm running water. You would never have to haul buckets from the creek. No, Thea said. You would not. They were all silent for a moment, standing in the chamber, breathing the warm mineral air, looking at the soft light filtering down through the fissures in the ceiling. The impossibility of it was beginning to fade, replaced by something else. Possibility. The sense that they were standing at the beginning of something at a door that had just opened onto a room they had never known existed. Silas walked to the eastern wall and put his face close to the seep of water. He breathed in the mineral smell and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he looked at Thea with an expression she had not seen on his face since the day she arrived. Hope. Well, he said, I suppose we have work to do. They stayed an hour that first morning. Silas walked the perimeter twice with the lantern measuring in paces, pressing his hands to the walls, looking up at the fissured ceiling. Prue examined the natural shelves, testing their depth and stability, already making mental calculations about storage capacity. Thea sat on the long, flat stretch of floor along the western wall and was quiet. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had not cried when her children died, had not cried when her first husband was buried, had not cried on any of the hard days that life had handed her over. 64 years. But sitting on that stone floor, feeling the warmth of the earth beneath her, watching the thin column of daylight move slowly across the chamber, as the morning passed, she felt something rise in her chest that was close to tears. She had asked herself many times over the past 2 years why she had come to Montana. The practical answer was that she had been a widow alone in Missouri with no children left to care for, and no particular reason to stay. The practical answer was that Silas's advertisement had offered something concrete: land work, purpose. The practical answer was that at 62 she had decided that starting over was preferable to slowly fading away in a place full of memories. But sitting in the hidden chamber, she understood that there had been another reason, a reason she had not known how to name until now. She had come to find this. Not this specific place. She had not known this place existed. But something like it. Some proof that the world still held surprises. Some evidence that 64 years of living had not shown her everything there was to see. Some gift hidden and waiting that would reward her for all the years of patience and attention and quiet looking. And now she had found it. The tears did not fall. They never did with Thea. But she sat on the warm stone and let the feeling move through her. And when Silas came to stand beside her, she reached up and took his hand and held it without speaking. He did not ask what she was thinking. He did not need to. He simply stood there holding her hand, looking at the chamber that had been waiting for them all along. After a while, Prue came over with 3 small white pebbles she had collected from the basin floor. She held them out to Thea. For your collection, she said, for the windowsill. Thea took the pebbles and turned them over in her palm. They were smooth and pale, worn down by water and time into perfect ovals. She put them in her pocket. Thank you, she said. When they came out of the passage, blinking into the gray October morning, the wind had picked up, and the temperature had dropped another degree. Thea turned and looked at the crack in the granite with new eyes. For 2 years she had walked past this wall. For 2 years she had seen only rock and wind, and the stubborn struggle of trying to make a life in a place that did not want to support one. She had been practical. She had been patient. She had been resigned in the quiet way that people become resigned to difficult circumstances without ever admitting it to themselves. And all that time this had been here. Warmth and light and water hidden behind a crack no wider than a man's shoulders. "It was always here," she said quietly. Silas looked at her. What was this? She gestured at the crack at the mountain, at everything it contained. "It was always here, and I never saw it. I walked past it every day, and I never thought to look. Most people would not have thought to look. I am not most people. I am someone who finds things, and I almost missed this." Silas was quiet for a moment, watching her face. Then he said, "But you did not miss it. You found it." "Yes." "Then that is what matters." Thea looked at the crack one more time. The darkness inside was impenetrable from here, giving no hint of what lay beyond. Just a gap in the rock. Just an opening that could have been nothing at all. But it was not nothing. 64 years, she said. 64 years I have been practical. I have done what needed to be done. I have not complained. I have not asked for more than what was reasonable. And I have walked past more opportunities than I can count, because I assumed they were not worth investigating. She paused, feeling the cold wind on her face, feeling the warmth still lingering in her chest from the chamber inside. "I am done walking past things," she said. "I am done assuming there is nothing to find. However many years I have left, I am going to spend them looking, really looking, at everything." Silas did not say anything. He simply nodded, understanding what she meant. Even if she had not explained it fully, they walked back to the cabin together. Thea and Silas and Prue, the three of them carrying a secret that would change everything. The wind pushed at their backs. The gray sky pressed down on the mountains. And behind them, hidden in the granite wall, a chamber full of warmth and light waited for them to return. This was only the beginning. The work began on a Monday because Silas Calloway was not a man to let wonder sit idle when there was still good daylight and a solid back. He had spent Sunday walking the perimeter of the basin 3 more times, measuring and remeasuring, pressing his hands to every surface, making calculations in his head that he did not share with anyone. By Monday morning, he had a plan. The first task was light. The fissures in the ceiling let in enough illumination to see by, but not enough to work by. Not enough to live by, if living was what they intended to do. Silas spent 2 days outside on the upper granite face with a cold chisel and a hammer, following the line of cracks with his hands, until he found 2 that could be widened without compromising the stone above. He worked carefully, a 1/4 inch at a time, checking below between each strike where Thea stood in the basin with the lantern watching the ceiling for signs of stress or fracture. The sound of his hammer rang through the rock and echoed in the chamber, a steady rhythm that became the heartbeat of those first days. On the second afternoon, something changed. Thea was standing near the eastern wall watching the ceiling. as she had been instructed when a thin beam of light appeared. It came through one of the fissures Silas had been working on a clean column no wider than her hand, falling straight down through the dim air of the basin and striking the stone floor in a bright circle. She stood very still watching it. The light moved as she watched, creeping slowly across the floor as the sun moved overhead. It was not much. A single beam, thin and pale, easily overlooked. But it was real. It was daylight finding its way into a place that had been dark for thousands of years. When Silas came down through the passage that evening, his hands raw from the chisel, and his shoulders aching from the awkward angle of the work, Thea showed him what he had accomplished. They stood together in the basin and watched the last of the afternoon light fade from the column, watched the bright circle on the floor dim and disappear as the sun dropped below the ridge. "Tomorrow," Silas said, "I will widen the second fissure. By the end of the week, we will have enough light to see by. And then we begin making this a place where people can live." Thea addressed the water. She had been thinking about it since that first morning, watching the way the seep ran down the eastern wall and pooled briefly before disappearing into the crack in the floor. The water was there. The water was warm. But the way it flowed was inefficient, wasteful, the work of nature rather than design. She spent 3 mornings with a tin cup and a flat stone studying the path the water took as it wept from the horizontal crack and ran down the rock face. She traced the route with her fingers, feeling for the slight variations in the stone that channeled the flow in one direction rather than another. She noted where the water moved fastest and where it slowed, where it pooled naturally and where it drained away. On the 4th morning, she began to work. She had hauled river clay up from the creek in a bucket, making 4 trips through the passage with the heavy load balanced against her hip. The clay was gray and dense and smelled of the stream bed it came from, and when she pressed it against the stone, it held its shape. She built a small levee along the natural lip of rock where the water pooled, raising the edge by 2 inches on the downstream side. She redirected the flow along the eastern wall using flat stones and clay to create a channel that kept the water moving in a controlled path, rather than spreading across the rock face and losing itself in a dozen small trickles. By the 3rd day, she had the water running in a clean line along the wall, pooling in the natural basin in a way that was consistent and predictable. The pool was never more than 8 inches deep, but it held. It was warm. It was clean enough for washing, clean enough for drinking if you did not mind the mineral taste. Prue helped with the later stages, hauling clay and mixing it with sand to make it set harder. Thomas came down through the passage on his good days, when his leg allowed it, and sat on a flat rock near the entrance to watch them work. He could not do the heavy labor anymore, but he had a craftsman's eye, and more than once his suggestions improved on their original designs. "The channel is too narrow here," he said one afternoon, pointing to a section near the top of the seep. "The water backs up when it flows fast. Widen it by half and you will have a steadier current." Thea widened the channel. Thomas was right. The shelves came next. Silas built frames from pine he had cut weeks earlier for another purpose wood that had been drying in the cabin rafters since late summer. He cut the pieces to length in the cabin, then carried them through the passage in sections short enough to manage the curve where the walls pressed close. The natural ledges along the northern wall were uneven, as all natural things were uneven. and fitting the frames to sit level required careful work. Prue did most of the notching, her quick hands and precise eye better suited to the task than Silas's larger, rougher ones. She measured twice and cut once, and when she set a frame on the stone, it sat true. They lined 3 shelves with split pine planks, each shelf large enough to hold a season's worth of provisions. The lowest shelf was coolest, tucked into a depression in the rock where the air barely moved, and Thea designated it for root vegetables and dairy. The middle shelf was warmer and drier, good for dried herbs and preserved beans. The highest shelf, where the air rose and circulated, would hold the dried meat and fish that needed ventilation to keep from spoiling. By the end of October, they had moved the cabin's full winter supply into the basin. Root vegetables in the lower shelf, dried herbs in the middle, 20 pounds of dried venison and elk on the upper shelf. For the first time since they had come to this land, their stores were out of the weather, protected from the fluctuations of temperature that spoiled food and attracted pests. Thea stood in front of the finished shelves on a cold evening in early November and felt something she had not felt in years: security. The bone-deep knowledge that they had enough, that they were prepared, that whatever the winter brought, they would survive it. She had not realized how much she had been carrying until the weight lifted. The sleeping nook was Silas's idea. He had been watching the way the warm air moved in the basin, rising from the stone floor and circulating through the chamber before escaping through the fissures in the ceiling. The warmest spot was along the western curve of the wall, where a natural indentation in the rock created a pocket of still air that held the heat better than anywhere else. "If we put a platform there," he said one evening, sketching on a piece of scrap paper, while Thea watched, raised on legs to keep the bedding off the stone and hang a curtain to trap the warm air inside it, would be like sleeping next to a fire that never goes out. They built it together over the course of a week. The platform was pine planks on low legs, solid enough to hold 2 people and sturdy enough to last for years. Thea stitched a curtain from a wool blanket that had worn threadbare on one side, doubling the fabric to make it heavier, and hung it on a rod of bent wire so that it could be pulled closed at night and opened during the day. She put their second set of bedding in the nook. The good quilts her cousin had sent from Missouri, the ones she had been saving for company that never came. A folded sheepskin for extra warmth on the coldest nights. 2 pillows stuffed with dried grasses that smelled of summer. The first night they slept in the basin, Silas fell asleep before Thea had finished adjusting the curtain. She lay on her side in the dark, listening to the sound of the seep, which was a very small sound, continuous and even, and thought about all the nights she had lain awake in the cabin, listening to the wind find every gap in the chinking. There was no wind here. The air was still and warm and smelled of minerals and stone. The sound of the water was like rain without any of the trouble rain usually brought. She closed her eyes and slept more deeply than she had in months. November passed. December came. The basin transformed week by week, each edition, making it more livable, more permanent, more like a home. Silas widened the light fissures until the columns of daylight were broad enough to read by. Thea built a preparation shelf in the first widened section of the passage, a plank surface at working height, where she could sort and cut and prepare food before carrying it out to the cooking fire. She hung hooks on the stone above it for her knife and a cloth towel, and put a small clay crock of salt in the corner. They did not abandon the cabin. They could not cook in the basin without the smoke collecting in the fissures and causing problems, and there were other tasks that required the surface. But they slept in this basin most nights, and they stored their food there, and they spent more and more of their time in the warm, hidden chamber, while the world above turned cold and white. The temperature outside dropped steadily as December progressed. By mid-month, the creek was frozen solid at the edges, and the wind that came through Granite Pass carried ice crystals that stung exposed skin. Silas made the walk up to the cabin each morning to check the traps and tend the fire, and each evening he came back down through the passage into the warmth with frost in his beard and relief in his eyes. They had found something remarkable. They all knew it. They did not speak of it often, but the knowledge was there in the way they moved through the space, in the care they took with every improvement, in the quiet satisfaction that settled over them as the weeks passed. And Thea, watching it all, began to understand something else. She had found this place. She had been the one to notice the crack, to feel the warmth, to insist on looking when Silas would have walked away. And now, seeing what they had built, she understood that finding things was only the beginning. The real work was what came after, the patience and effort required to transform a discovery into something lasting. She had been a finder all her life. Now she was learning to be a builder. The seeds were her secret. She had brought them from Missouri in a tin that had once held tobacco, a collection of kitchen herb seeds she had saved from her garden there, thyme and sage and oregano, a few precious onion starts wrapped in damp cloth, some radish seeds that were probably too old to germinate but might surprise her. She had planned to plant them in the cabin window come spring, starting them indoors before the ground thawed enough to transplant. It was what she had always done in Missouri, and everywhere else she had lived. Wait for the right season. Follow the rules that had been handed down through generations of farmers and gardeners. Be patient. But the basin was different. She noticed it first in early December when she was working near the eastern wall and saw that the small leaf plant she had observed on her first visit had spread. It covered perhaps 4 square feet now, where it had covered only 2 or 3 before. The leaves were green and healthy, fed by the mineral water and the warmth rising from the stone. She knelt beside it and touched the leaves gently. They were soft and slightly damp, thriving in conditions that should have killed any normal plant. No direct sunlight, no soil to speak of, just the thin layer of sedite that had accumulated along the base of the wall. No seasons, no frost, no variation in temperature. And yet, it grew. That night, Thea lay awake in the sleeping nook, listening to Silas breathe beside her, and thought about seeds. She thought about the rules she had always followed and the reasons behind them. She thought about the plant growing along the seep wall, defying everything she knew about what plants needed to survive. In the morning, she went back to the eastern wall with her seed tin. She did not tell anyone what she was doing. Not Silas, not Prue, not Thomas. She simply knelt by the seep where the warm water kept the air humid, and the stone was always damp, and pressed several seeds into the thin layer of clay that had accumulated there. Thyme first, then sage, then 3 onion starts, their pale roots spreading as she tucked them into the mineral-rich sediment. She covered them gently with more clay and sat back on her heels looking at the spot where she had planted them. There was no reason to believe they would grow. Every rule she knew said they would rot in the darkness or fail to germinate or wither for lack of proper light. But the small-leafed plant had grown. Against all reason, against all expectation, it had grown. Thea stood up and wiped her hands on her apron and went back to her work without saying anything to anyone. She would check the seeds tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. She was a patient woman. She could wait. The first week of January brought Hector Pruitt to the basin. He had come to return an auger he had borrowed in September, and when he found Silas working near the crack in the granite wall, his curiosity got the better of him. "What in God's name are you doing up here?" he asked, watching Silas smooth a patch of clay around the entrance to the passage. Silas hesitated. He looked at the crack, then at Hector, then back at the crack. They had not told anyone about the basin. It had not been a deliberate decision so much as an instinct, a shared understanding among the four of them that some things needed to be comprehended by the people who lived them before they were spoken aloud to anyone else. The basin felt like a secret, and secrets once shared could not be taken back. But Hector Pruitt was a decent man. He had helped Silas raise the cabin walls 3 years ago, and his wife Martha, for all her superior airs, had brought soup when Thea was sick in the first winter. They were neighbors, the closest thing to friends the Callaways had in this isolated place. "Come and see," Silas said. He led Hector through the passage, warning him about the narrow sections, telling him to watch his head where the ceiling dipped. Hector went slowly, one hand on the wall, his breathing loud in the confined space. When they emerged into the basin, Hector stopped. He stood at the entrance to the chamber for perhaps 4 minutes without saying a word. His eyes moved from the columns of light filtering down through the fissures to the shelves lined with provisions along the northern wall, to the seep of warm water running down the eastern face, to the curtained sleeping nook in the western alcove. Finally, he spoke. "Lord Almighty, Silas." It was not a question. It was not even really a statement. It was an exhale, a release of something that had built up inside him as he looked around the impossible space. "How long has this been here?" he asked. "Forever, I expect. We only found it in October." Hector walked slowly into the basin, turning as he went, reaching out to touch the warm stone. "The temperature, it must be 55 degrees in here, year-round as far as we can tell. And the water, warm, clean, it never stops flowing." Hector shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head when the world has presented him with something he cannot quite process. "I have lived in this valley for 11 years. 11 years. And I never knew this was here. Neither did we. Not until Thea found the crack." Hector looked at Silas with new eyes. "She found it. She has a gift for finding things." They stood in the basin for another half hour, Hector asking questions and Silas answering them both. Men speaking quietly as though they were in a church or a graveyard, someplace where loud voices would be inappropriate. When Hector finally left, climbing back through the passage into the January cold, he turned at the entrance and looked at Silas with an expression that was hard to read. "You know what this valley has been saying about your land for years," he said. "About the soil and the location, and the chances of making a real go of it. I know what they have been saying. They were wrong." Hector looked at the crack in the granite, at the narrow opening that led to the impossible chamber inside. They were all wrong. He walked back down the hill toward his own property, and Silas watched him go, and neither of them knew that the conversation had set something in motion that could not be stopped. Word moved through a valley the way water moves, finding its own level, and getting into places you would not expect. By the end of January, 3 more families knew about the basin. The Aldersons from the north end of the valley came by invitation a Sunday afternoon visit, where Silas led them through the passage and showed them the seat and the shelves and the columns of light. The Harpers from east of the pass heard about it from the Pruitts and asked if they could see. Old Ezra Mitchell, who lived alone in a cabin near the trading post, rode up one morning with no invitation at all and stood at the crack until Silas came out to see what he wanted. Most came away impressed. More than impressed, they came away changed, carrying with them the memory of warm air and filtered light and the sound of water running over stone. They went back to their own cold cabins in their own difficult circumstances and thought about what they had seen. Not everyone was pleased. The news reached Josiah Croft in the second week of February, carried to him by his wife, who had heard it from Martha Pruitt at the trading post. Croft had been in the valley since 1871, 16 years of hard work and calculated decisions that had made him the largest landholder in the area. He owned good ground, wheat ground, and he had opinions about who deserved what in this valley and why. The Callaways, in his view, did not deserve much. They had a poor claim on poor ground, a cabin that looked like it might blow over in a strong wind, and no real prospects for improvement. He had said as much to anyone who would listen, and most people had agreed with him. The Callaway place was a losing proposition. Everyone knew it, and now apparently everyone was wrong. Croft rode up to Granite Pass on a cold, clear afternoon in mid-February. He found Silas mending a harness near the cabin and dismounted without greeting. "I hear you found something in that rock wall," he said. Silas looked up from his work. He had never liked Croft, and the feeling was mutual, but there were social proprieties to be observed. Word travels fast. Word travels. Is it true a cave of some kind with hot springs? It is a natural basin. There is warm water, yes. Warm air. Croft's eyes moved to the granite ridge, scanning the rock face until he found the crack. "Show me." It was not a request. Croft did not make requests. He made demands phrased in ways that technically allowed for refusal, but made clear that refusal would have consequences. Silas stood slowly setting aside the harness. "The passage is narrow. Tight quarters. I've been in tight quarters before." They walked together to the crack, Silas leading Croft following 2 steps behind. When they reached the opening, Silas stepped aside and gestured toward the darkness. "It goes back about 40 feet. Watch your head at the curve." Croft looked at the crack. He looked at the narrow gap, at the darkness beyond, at the stone pressing in from both sides. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he stepped back. "Tell me about the land filing," he said. "Your claim. What are the exact boundaries?" The question caught Silas off guard. The cabin and the acreage surrounding it. The standard homestead allotment. The rock face. Is it included specifically in the filing? Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. The filing covers the land. The rock is on the land. The rock is adjacent to the land. There is a difference. Croft's eyes were still on the crack, calculating. You file a mineral claim on that formation. There are no minerals. It is not a mine. You are drawing water from it. Water has value. Heat has value. Croft finally looked at Silas, and his expression was not hostile exactly, but it was not friendly either. It was the expression of a man who has found an opportunity and is deciding how to exploit it. A man has a right to ask questions about boundaries and claims. A man has a right to protect his interests. What interest do you have in my land? Croft did not answer. He turned and walked back to his horse mounted and sat looking down at Silas from the saddle. I am just asking questions, he said. For now. He rode back down the valley without another word. That night, Thea sat at the cabin table and listened to Silas describe the conversation. Prue and Thomas were there too. Thomas leaning against the wall with his bad legs stretched out before him. Prue perched on a stool near the fire. He did not go in, Silas said. He looked at the crack and he stepped back. But he asked about the boundaries. The claim filing, Thea said. Show me. Silas retrieved the document from the metal box where they kept their important papers. It was 3 years old, creased from handling the ink faded in places. Thea spread it on the table and studied it by lamplight. The filing described the cabin location and the acreage surrounding it. It mentioned the shelf of land between the 2 granite ridges. It did not, as far as she could see, specifically include the ridges themselves. The rock formation, she said slowly. Is it on our land or adjacent to it? I have always assumed it was on our land. The eastern marker is at the base of the ridge. At the base, not at the corner. Silas frowned. I set that marker myself 3 years ago. I would have to look again to be certain where exactly I put it. Thea was quiet for a moment, looking at the claim filing, thinking about Croft's questions and what they implied. Croft was not a man who asked idle questions. He was a man who looked for weaknesses, for gaps, for opportunities that other people had overlooked. He knows something, she said. Or he thinks he does. He sees a way to challenge our ownership. On what grounds? I do not know yet, but if the rock formation is not explicitly included in our claim, there may be a way for him to file a separate claim on it. A mineral survey, perhaps. Something that would give him standing to contest our use of the basin. The room was silent. The fire popped. Outside, the wind moaned around the corners of the cabin. Can he do that? Thomas asked. Just file a claim on something we have been using for months. I do not know what he can do, but I know what we need to do. Thea folded the claim document and handed it back to Silas. Tomorrow I want to see the exact location of every boundary marker, every one, and I want to measure the distances myself. The snow was deep on the eastern slope, drifted against the granite wall in places to a height of 3 feet. Thea walked through it slowly, her boots breaking through the crust. With each step, the cold air burning in her lungs. She was alone. She had insisted on it. This was her task, her responsibility, and she did not want anyone else's observations mixed with her own. She needed to see the boundaries clearly, without interpretation, without assumption, without the distortion that came from hearing someone else's description first. The eastern marker was a flat granite stone that Silas had set at the corner of the property 3 years ago. He had chosen it because it was distinctive a pale gray color that stood out against the darker rock around it, and he had buried it deep enough that it would not shift with the frost heaves. Thea knelt in the snow beside the marker and brushed the ice away from its surface. She looked at the stone, then at the granite ridge rising behind it, then back at the stone. Silas had said he put the marker at the base of the ridge, but that was not quite accurate. The marker was at the corner of the ridge where the formation angled back toward the west. Not at the base, at the corner. She stood and looked at the ridge, trying to visualize the boundary line that ran from this marker to the next. If the line ran along the base of the formation, then the ridge itself and everything inside it would be outside the claim. But if the line ran from corner to corner, following the angles of the rock rather than the base, she needed to measure. She had brought a length of rope knotted at intervals of 1 pace, and she used it now to mark the distance from the eastern marker to the northern marker, counting knots as she went. Then she measured from the northern marker to the western marker, and from there back around to the south. It took her most of the day. The snow made the work difficult, and her hands grew numb despite the gloves she wore, and twice she had to stop and warm herself by walking in circles until the feeling returned to her fingers. But by late afternoon, she had measured every boundary of the property and she had counted every knot. And she had made notes in the small book she carried in her coat pocket. That night, she sat at the table with her notes and the claim document and a piece of paper, on which she drew a rough map of the property. Silas watched her work but did not interrupt. Prue sat nearby, ready to help if asked. Thea drew the boundary lines according to her measurements. She marked the location of each cornerstone. She sketched the granite ridge along the eastern edge. And then she sat back and looked at what she had drawn. The eastern marker was not at the base of the ridge. It was at the corner where the formation jutted out before angling back toward the west. And the boundary line running from that corner to the northeastern marker did not follow the base of the formation. It crossed the formation itself, which meant the ridge was not adjacent to their land. It was inside their land. The rock and everything within it was theirs. Prue, she said quietly, check my calculations. Prue took the notes and the map and the claim document. She worked through the numbers herself, her lips moving slightly as she calculated. After 10 minutes, she looked up. The ridge is inside the boundary, by at least 40 feet at the widest point. You are certain the marker placement is clear. Silas set the eastern stone at the corner of the formation, not the base. That places the entire formation, including the interior, within the filed claim. Thea let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Then Croft has no grounds for a separate filing. The basin is on our land. It has always been on our land. According to these measurements, yes. Silas leaned forward. Will that be enough? If Croft challenges, will our measurements hold up? They will need to be verified by the land office, Thea said. An official survey. But the marker locations are on record and our measurements align with the original filing. If the surveyor confirms what we have found, Croft's challenge fails. She looked at the map she had drawn at the boundary lines and the ridge and the basin hidden inside. 3 days of work in the snow and cold, measuring every inch of their property. And now she understood something that had been true all along, but that no one had realized. The basin was theirs, not by luck or accident, but by the placement of a marker 3 years ago. A marker Silas had set without knowing what he was including in the claim. Some things Thea thought were meant to be found, and some boundaries were meant to hold. The following week, she rode to Granite Pass to see the land agent. His name was Carroll, a young man in a city coat who kept meticulous files and spoke with the precise diction of someone who had been educated back east. He listened to Thea's explanation without interrupting, then asked to see her notes and measurements. "The eastern boundary marker," he said, tracing the line on her map with his finger. "You say it is at the corner of the formation, not the base." "That is correct. And you measured from that marker to each of the other corners yourself." "I did." Carroll was quiet for a moment, studying the map. Then he pulled a file from his cabinet and compared it to Thea's notes. "The marker locations are consistent with the original filing," he said finally. "If your measurements are accurate, the formation is within the claim boundary. Can you verify that? I can request an official survey. Given the dispute that seems to be developing, it would be prudent." He looked at her over the top of the file. "Mr. Croft filed a preliminary mineral survey application yesterday. He claims the rock formation along your eastern boundary is prospectively mineral-bearing and requests examination under the mining laws." Thea felt the cold settle into her chest despite the warmth of the office stove. He moved quickly. He is a man who does not hesitate when he sees an opportunity. "Can his application proceed if the formation is within our boundary?" "If the survey determines the formation is on your land, his application fails. There is no exterior ground available for mineral claims." Carroll closed the file. "I will schedule the survey for the earliest available date. In the meantime, I would advise you to document everything. Every measurement, every marker location, every observation. The more evidence you can provide, the stronger your position." Thea stood. "When will the survey be conducted?" "The territorial surveyor is occupied until early March, the 5th, most likely." "And until then?" "Until then, Mrs. Calloway, I would advise patience and caution." She checked the seeds that evening. She had been checking them every few days, kneeling by the seep wall in the dim light of the basin, looking for any sign of change in the clay, where she had pressed the thyme and sage and onion starts. For weeks there had been nothing. The clay looked the same as it had the day she planted. The seeds were invisible beneath the surface, doing whatever seeds did in the darkness, succeeding or failing, without any outward sign. But this evening something was different. She knelt in the warm air near the seep and looked at the clay and felt her breath catch. Green. 6 small green shoots each, no larger than a blade of grass, pushing up through the mineral-rich sediment. 6 tiny plants, alive and growing in a place where no plant had any right to grow. The onion starts were the most visible, their pale green tips already beginning to unfurl. But the thyme was there too, a cluster of 3 barely distinguishable shoots, and what might have been the first stirrings of sage beside them. Thea sat back on her heels and stared at the seedlings. Outside above her, the ground was frozen 8 inches deep. The temperature at night had not risen above 12 degrees in a month. Every garden in the valley was dormant, every field covered in snow, every farmer waiting out the long months until spring made growing things possible again. And here in the basin in the first week of February, she had germinated seeds. She understood the implications immediately. This was not just a place to store food and sleep warm. This was a place where things could grow when nothing else in the territory could grow. A place where the rules that govern the world above did not apply. If people knew what was possible here, they would come. They would come with claims and challenges and demands. They would see the warm water and the constant temperature and the thriving seedlings, and they would want it for themselves. Croft already wanted it. He did not know about the seeds, but he knew enough. He knew there was value here, value that went beyond shelter and storage, value that was worth fighting for. Thea looked at the tiny green shoots pushing up through the clay. She would not tell anyone about this, not yet. Not until the survey was complete and the boundary was confirmed and the basin was legally, unquestionably, permanently theirs. Some secrets needed to stay secret until the time was right. She stood up and brushed the clay from her knees and went back to the sleeping nook where Silas was already lying down with his eyes closed. "Everything all right?" he asked without opening his eyes. "Yes," Thea said. "Everything is fine." She lay down beside him and listened to the sound of the seep and thought about the survey scheduled for March 5th and the seeds growing in the darkness and the man on the other side of the valley who wanted to take it all away. 26 days until the survey. 26 days to wait. She closed her eyes and began to count. Thea woke before dawn on the morning of March 5th. She had not slept well. The anticipation had built steadily over the weeks, growing heavier as the date approached. And last night it had kept her mind spinning when her body needed rest. She lay in the sleeping nook, listening to Silas breathe beside her, watching the darkness gradually lighten as the first gray hints of morning filtered through the fissures in the ceiling. The survey would begin at 9 o'clock. Carol had sent word that Aldous Beck, the territorial surveyor, would arrive at the property by 8:30. Beck was a weathered man of few words who had been conducting land surveys in Montana Territory for 11 years. And his reputation was one of absolute impartiality. He did not favor landowners. He did not favor challengers. He measured what was there and reported what he found, and his findings had never been successfully disputed in court. Thea dressed in the dim light and made her way through the passage to the outside world. The morning was cold and clear. The sky pale blue above the mountains, the snow on the ground beginning to crust over with the night's freeze. She walked to the eastern boundary marker and stood beside it, looking at the granite ridge that had become the center of everything. The crack was invisible from here, just another shadow on the rock face. You had to know where to look to see it. Had to know what you were looking for, to understand what it meant. For 3 years, it had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice. She had noticed. She had found it. And now she was about to learn whether finding it had been enough. Beck arrived at 8:23, riding a gray horse that looked as weathered as he did. Carol came with him, neat in his city coat despite the cold, carrying a leather satchel full of documents. Silas met them at the edge of the property and led them to the cabin where Thea had coffee waiting on the stove. Beck declined the coffee. He looked around the cabin with the professional disinterest of a man who had seen 1,000 similar cabins in 1,000 similar locations, then asked to see the boundary markers. They started at the eastern marker, the flat gray stone that Silas had set 3 years ago. Beck knelt beside it and brushed away the remaining snow, examining the stone's placement, its depth, its relationship to the surrounding terrain. He made notes in a small book using a pencil that he kept sharpened to a precise point. "You set this marker yourself?" he asked Silas. "Yes. In the summer of '84. At the corner of the formation." Silas looked at the ridge rising behind the marker. "At the corner. Yes." Beck made another note. He stood and measured the distance from the marker to the rock face with a surveyor's chain, calling out numbers to Carroll, who recorded them in the official file. Then he moved to the northern marker and repeated the process. It took most of the morning. Beck worked methodically, measuring each section of the boundary, checking his figures twice, making notes that no one else was allowed to see. He asked few questions and made no comments on what he was finding. His face remained expressionless throughout. At 11:30, he asked to see the formation. Silas led him to the crack in the granite. Beck looked at it for a long moment, then at his notebook, then back at the crack. "This goes into the rock," he asked. "About 40 feet. There is a chamber inside." Beck nodded but did not ask to enter. He measured the position of the crack relative to the boundary markers, checked his figures, and made a final note in his book. Then he closed the book and looked at Silas. "The formation from corner marker to corner marker," he said, "is entirely within the filed boundaries of the Callaway homestead claim." Silas exhaled. Beside him, Thea felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had been carrying for weeks without fully acknowledging it. "There is no ground exterior to that claim available for a mineral survey as described in the Croft application," Beck continued. "The application is without basis." He put the notebook in his pocket and turned toward his horse. The survey was over. The matter was decided. But there was one more thing Thea needed to see. She looked past Beck, past Carroll, past the horses standing patiently in the cold morning air. She looked down the slope toward the edge of the property where a figure on horseback had been watching since 9 o'clock. Josiah Croft sat motionless in the saddle, too far away to hear what Beck had said, but close enough to see the surveyor shaking hands with Silas, close enough to read the outcome in their body language. He did not move for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned his horse and rode back down the valley. He did not look back. The formal finding was filed the following week. Carroll sent word that Croft's application had been dismissed, and that Thea's amendment to the claim, adding the geological formation to the explicit language of the filing, had been submitted for approval. 30 days later, the document came back with a land office seal and Carroll's signature at the bottom. Thea sat at the cabin table and looked at the seal for a long time. Silas sat across from her, watching her face. "It is done," he said. "Yes. The basin is ours. Officially, legally, permanently ours." Thea traced the edge of the seal with her finger, feeling the raised impression of the territorial emblem. "It was always ours," she said quietly. "The marker was in the right place. The boundary was correct. We were not claiming something that did not belong to us. We were simply proving what had been true all along. But now the paper agrees." She looked up at him and smiled just slightly. "Now the paper agrees." Outside, the first signs of spring were beginning to show. The snow was melting on the south-facing slopes, and the creek was running higher with snowmelt from the mountains above. In the basin, the seeds Thea had planted were thriving, a small garden of green against the gray stone wall, growing stronger every day. She would show Silas the garden soon. She would show him what was possible in the warm, constant air of the chamber. What could be grown when the world above was still locked in winter? But not today. Today, she simply sat with the document that confirmed what she had known since October. Since the moment she pressed her hand against the warm stone and felt the breath of the mountain against her skin. Some things were meant to be found, and some things once found were meant to be kept. The spring of 1888 arrived slowly, the way spring always arrived in Granite Pass, with false starts and setbacks and sudden returns to winter that tested the patience of everyone who lived there. But when it finally took hold in late April, it came with a warmth that seemed to promise better days ahead. Thea stood at the entrance to the passage on a morning in early May, looking out at the shelf of land that had been her home for nearly 3 years. The snow was gone from all but the highest peaks now. The creek ran full and fast with snowmelt, and the first green shoots of wild grass were pushing up through the brown remnants of last year's growth. The air smelled of mud and new life, and the particular freshness that came after a long winter. Behind her in the basin, the garden she had planted in secret was flourishing. She had shown Silas the seedlings in late March after the survey was complete, and the amended claim was filed, and there was no longer any reason to keep secrets. He had knelt beside the seep wall and looked at the green shoots growing in the mineral clay, and he had been silent for a long moment before speaking. "You planted these in February," he said. "Yes. When the ground outside was frozen solid." "Yes." He reached out and touched one of the onion starts, its green tip already beginning to unfurl into a proper leaf. "How is this possible?" Thea had thought about that question many times over the weeks she had been tending the seedlings. She did not have a scientific answer. Not really. She knew that the constant temperature of the basin, somewhere between 50 and 55 degrees, was warmer than the soil outside would be until late May. She knew that the warm water from the seep kept the air humid and the clay moist. She knew that the light filtering through the fissures Silas had widened was enough, just barely enough, to sustain growth. But knowing the factors did not fully explain the result. The seeds should not have germinated. The seedlings should not have survived. And yet here they were, green and alive, and growing stronger every day. "Some things find a way," she said. "When the conditions are right, life persists." Silas had looked at her then with an expression she could not quite read. Pride, perhaps, or wonder, or simply the recognition that the woman he had married was capable of things he had not fully understood. "You did not tell anyone," he said. "No. Not even me. No." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I needed to know if it would work before I said anything. And I needed the survey to be complete before anyone knew what was possible here. If Croft had learned that we could grow food in the basin year-round, he would have fought even harder to take it." Silas nodded slowly. "You were protecting us. I was protecting what we found." He had stood up then and put his hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was as close to affection as he typically came. "You are a remarkable woman, Thea Calloway." She had not known what to say to that, so she had said nothing. But she had carried the words with her in the weeks since, turning them over in her mind during quiet moments, finding them true in ways she had not expected. By May, the garden had expanded to cover nearly 15 square feet of the eastern wall. Thea had added to it steadily as spring progressed, transplanting new starts from the cabin window, experimenting with different seeds and different placements along the seep. The original thyme and sage were thriving, spreading into small bushes that filled the air with fragrance when she brushed against them. The onion starts had multiplied into a proper row, their green stalks growing taller each week. She had added radishes, which germinated quickly and were already forming small red bulbs beneath the soil. She had added lettuce, which seemed to love the constant humidity and the filtered light. And she had added tomatoes. The tomato plants were her greatest experiment, the one she was least certain would succeed. Tomatoes needed warmth, yes, but they also needed strong light, more light than the basin's fissures could provide. She had started 3 plants as seedlings in the cabin window in late March, nurturing them through the last weeks of winter, watching them grow leggy and pale as they reached toward the glass. In April, she had transplanted them to the basin, placing them directly beneath the widest fissure, where the columns of daylight were strongest. She had built small frames of wire and twine to support them as they grew, and she had watched them anxiously for signs of failure. They had not failed. The plants were smaller than they would have been outside in full sun, and their leaves were a paler green than she was used to. But they were growing. They were healthy. And by late May, 2 of the 3 had begun to flower. Thea stood before them on a warm afternoon in early June, looking at the small yellow blossoms that would, if all went well, become the first tomatoes ever grown in Granite Pass before July. Silas came to stand beside her, looking at the plants with the expression of a man who has seen something impossible become ordinary. "Will they bear fruit?" he asked. "I believe so. The flowers look healthy. If the bees find their way in through the fissures, or if I pollinate them by hand, we should have tomatoes by midsummer. In June, perhaps July. But yes, months before anyone else in the valley." Silas shook his head slowly. 3 years I have been trying to grow things on this land. 3 years of poor yields and failed crops, and watching the Pruitts harvest wheat while I struggled to keep my oats alive. And now this. "The land was never the problem," Thea said. "The land was just the surface. What we needed was underneath." She reached out and touched one of the tomato plants, feeling the soft fuzz of its leaves against her fingertips. The plant was alive in a way that felt almost miraculous, green and vital and full of promise. 64 years, she said quietly. 64 years of doing things the expected way, the practical way, the way everyone said was right. And then I found a crack in a wall, and everything changed. You found more than a crack." "No." She shook her head. "That is exactly what I found. A crack. A small opening that everyone else walked past without seeing. The difference is that I looked inside." The Pruitt family came to visit in the 3rd week of May. Hector and Martha rode up with their 4 children, a Sunday afternoon outing that Martha had been requesting since Hector first described the basin in January. She had not believed his account, not fully. and she wanted to see for herself what all the talk was about. Thea led them through the passage, warning them about the narrow sections and the low spots where the ceiling dipped. Martha went reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with the close walls and the darkness. But her discomfort vanished the moment she emerged into the basin. She stood at the entrance to the chamber and looked around, with her mouth slightly open, her usual expression of faint superiority entirely absent. The light was good that afternoon. 2 strong columns of gold falling through the widened fissures and illuminating the space with a warmth that seemed to come from the air itself. The sound of the seep was a gentle constant in the background, and the smell of the herbs growing along the eastern wall filled the chamber with fragrance. "Lord," Martha said softly. "Lord Almighty." It was the most subdued Thea had ever heard her. The children scattered immediately, exploring every corner of the basin with the fearless curiosity of youth. They examined the shelves along the northern wall, still stocked with the last of the winter provisions. They knelt by the seep and put their hands in the warm water. The youngest, a girl of 6, found the row of white pebbles that Thea had begun collecting and asked if she could hold one. "You may look," Thea said, "but those stay here." The girl nodded solemnly and crouched beside the pebbles, studying them as though they contained some secret she might decipher. Martha walked slowly through the space, touching the walls, looking up at the fractured ceiling, stopping for a long time in front of the garden growing along the seep. "You grew these here?" she asked. "I did. In winter. I planted the first seeds in February. They germinated within 2 weeks." Martha stared at the plants, at the tomatoes with their yellow flowers, at the herbs, spreading in fragrant bushes, at the row of onions and the cluster of radishes and the bed of lettuce that was already large enough to harvest. "That is not possible," she said. "And yet." Martha turned to look at Thea, and something had changed in her expression. The superiority that usually defined her interactions with the Calloway family was gone, replaced by something that might have been respect. "We have been growing wheat on what everyone calls the best ground in the valley," she said slowly. "We have been telling ourselves and everyone else that we chose well, and you chose poorly. That our success was deserved and your struggle was inevitable. I know what you have been saying. We were wrong." Martha looked around the basin again at the light and the water and the impossible garden. "We were entirely wrong." Thea did not respond to that. There was nothing to say, really. The basin spoke for itself. Hector had been standing near the sleeping nook, examining the construction of the platform and the curtain arrangement. Now he walked over to join the women, his face thoughtful. "You know what this valley has been saying about your ground for 10 years, Thea," he said. "Everyone thought you had the worst claim in the pass. Rock and wind and nothing else. I know what they said." Well, Hector looked at the tomato plants, at the bright yellow flowers that would become fruit in another month. They were wrong. Prue had come into the basin behind the visitors, and she was standing near the preparation shelf in the passage, watching the scene with a small smile on her face. She caught Thea's eye and nodded slightly, an acknowledgement of something they both understood. The valley had been wrong about many things. About the land. About the Calloways. About what was possible when someone looked past the surface to what lay beneath. And now the valley was beginning to understand. The Alderson family came in June, and the Harpers came the week after that. Each visit followed the same pattern, Thea leading them through the passage. The moment of stunned silence when they emerged into the basin, the slow exploration of the space, the questions about how it was possible and how long it had been here, and why no one had ever found it before. Thea answered their questions patiently. She showed them the seep and the shelves in the garden. She let them taste the mineral water and feel the warmth of the stone walls. She watched their faces change as they understood what they were seeing. Not everyone came away with the same reaction. Most were simply impressed, their admiration genuine and uncomplicated. They returned to their own properties with stories to tell and a new respect for the Calloway family. Some were envious, their congratulations tinged with a bitterness they could not quite conceal. The valley was a hard place, and when one family found unexpected good fortune, it was natural for others to wish they had found it first. A few were suspicious. Old Ezra Mitchell, who had lived alone in the valley longer than anyone except Croft, came back for a second visit in late June and spent an hour walking the perimeter of the basin, studying the walls and the ceiling with an intensity that made Thea uncomfortable. "Hot springs," he said finally. "Has to be. Thermal activity under the mountain heating the rock and the water. I have heard of such things in Yellowstone. Never thought to find them here." "Does it matter what causes it?" Thea asked. Ezra looked at her with his weathered eyes. "Everything has a cause, Mrs. Calloway. And causes have consequences. You would do well to remember that." He left without explaining what he meant, and Thea watched him go with a feeling she could not quite name. Unease, perhaps, or simply the awareness that finding something remarkable was not the same as understanding it. But the unease faded quickly. There was too much to do, too much to celebrate, too much evidence that the basin was everything they had hoped it would be, and more. July came, and with it the tomatoes. Thea checked them every morning, watching the green fruits swell on the vine, counting the days until they would begin to ripen. She had pollinated the flowers herself, using a small brush to transfer pollen from blossom to blossom, and her efforts had been rewarded with a better fruit set than she had dared to hope for. By the second week of July, the first tomatoes were beginning to show hints of red. She picked the first ripe fruit on a Thursday morning, holding it in her palm and feeling its weight, its warmth, its impossible reality. A tomato ripe in July, grown in a cave inside a granite mountain in Montana territory. There was no precedent for it. There was no explanation that fully accounted for it. There was only the fruit itself, red and firm and real. She brought it to the cabin and set it on the table, and the four of them gathered around to look at it. "Well," Thomas said, finally breaking the silence, "are we going to eat it or worship it?" Prue laughed, the sound bright and unexpected in the quiet cabin. "Both, perhaps. It deserves both." Thea sliced the tomato into 4 pieces, one for each of them. The flesh inside was red and juicy, exactly as a tomato should be. She handed the slices around and watched as her family tasted the first fruits of her experiment. "Sweet," Silas said, chewing slowly. "Sweeter than I expected. The mineral water, perhaps, or the constant warmth. I do not know exactly what makes the difference." "Does it matter?" Prue asked. "It tastes like summer. It tastes like everything we have been waiting for." Thea ate her own slice, slowly savoring the flavor, the texture. the culmination of months of work and worry and hope. The tomato was not perfect. It was smaller than tomatoes grown in full sun, and the texture was slightly different, softer than she was used to. But it was a tomato ripe and edible, grown in conditions that should have made growth impossible. She thought about all the things people had told her were impossible over the years. Things she had believed, limits she had accepted, boundaries she had never thought to question. She thought about the 64 years she had spent doing what was expected, being practical, not asking for more than what seemed reasonable. And she thought about the crack in the wall, the narrow opening she had almost walked past, the moment of decision when she had chosen to look instead of assuming there was nothing to see. "I am going to expand the garden," she said. "Next winter. We will start earlier and plant more. If tomatoes can grow here, other things can grow too. Peppers, perhaps. Squash. Things we have never been able to grow in this climate." "An underground farm," Thomas said, a note of wonder in his voice. "Why not? The conditions are right. The water is warm year-round. The temperature never drops below 50 degrees. We could grow food through the winter when everyone else is living on preserved stores and waiting for spring." Silas looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize over the past months. It was the expression of a man watching his wife become something he had not expected, someone larger and more capable than the practical widow who had stepped off the stage 3 years ago. "You have plans," he said. "I have ideas. Whether they become plans depends on what we learn." "What else is there to learn?" Thea smiled slightly. "Everything. We have only begun to understand what is possible here. Every experiment teaches us something new. Every season will bring new questions and new opportunities." She paused, looking around the cabin at the family she had joined and the life they were building together. "I spent 64 years thinking I knew what my life would be. I was wrong. And I'm glad I was wrong, because what I found is better than anything I imagined." The last days of July brought a heat wave that baked the valley and drove everyone to seek shade wherever they could find it. The creek dropped to its lowest level of the summer, and the grass on the shelf turned brown and brittle. The cabin was stifling during the day, the air inside thick and still despite the windows thrown open to catch any hint of breeze. But the basin remained cool. Thea spent more and more time in the chamber. As the heat intensified, working on the garden, tending the shelves, simply sitting in the mild air, and enjoying the respite from the oppressive temperatures above. The constant 55 degrees that had been a blessing in winter was equally welcome now, a refuge from the extremes that made life in Montana so challenging. The others joined her when they could. Thomas brought his mending down and worked by the light of the fissures. Prue set up a small desk near the preparation shelf and did the household accounts in the cool air. Even Silas, who still spent most of his days working outside, came down in the hottest hours of the afternoon to rest and recover before returning to his tasks. They were becoming a family who lived underground as much as above, who had adapted to the rhythm of 2 homes, 2 environments, 2 ways of being in the world. The cabin was still necessary for cooking and for certain tasks that required more space and light than the basin provided. But the basin was where they slept, where they stored their food, where they gathered in the evenings to talk about the day and plan for tomorrow. It was home in a way the cabin had never quite managed to be. On a warm evening in late July, Thea sat at the edge of the stone pool near the seep. her collection of white pebbles arranged in a row beside her. The collection had grown over the months. She had found pebbles throughout the basin, smooth white stones worn down by water and time, and she had gathered them the way she had always gathered things, the way Owen had gathered things in the story she sometimes told herself about a boy with a diviner's eye. Each pebble was unique, shaped by forces she could not see into forms she could not have predicted. Together they made a pattern that pleased her. The column of light from the fissures above had shifted to gold as the afternoon waned. The seep ran its quiet, continuous note, the sound she had come to love more than almost any other sound in the world. In the passage behind her, she could hear Silas working at something, the scrape of metal on stone as he sharpened a tool. Above, though she could not hear it from here, she knew Prue was in the cabin preparing the evening meal. Everything was exactly as it should be. She thought about the year that had passed since she first pressed her hand against the warm stone and felt the breath of the mountain. So much had changed. The basin had transformed from an empty chamber into a home. The garden had grown from a few hopeful seeds into a thriving plot that promised food through the winter. The legal challenge had been met, and overcome, the boundary confirmed the claim secured. And she had changed too. She was still the same practical woman who had arrived on the stage 3 years ago, the widow from Missouri who had answered an advertisement for a wife. But she was also something more now. She was the woman who had found the crack in the wall, the woman who had insisted on looking when everyone else would have walked away, the woman who had planted seeds in February and grown tomatoes in July and proved that the impossible was simply the untried. 64 years old, and she had finally understood something that had eluded her all her life. The world was full of cracks, full of narrow openings that led to hidden places, full of possibilities waiting to be discovered by anyone patient enough to look. Most people walk past them without seeing. Most people assume there was nothing to find, that the surface was all there was, that the visible world contained everything worth knowing. But Thea had learned to look deeper, to press her hand against the stone and feel for warmth, to trust the instinct that told her there was more here than met the eye. That was her gift, not divining exactly, not magic, just the willingness to pay attention, to notice what others missed, to believe that finding things was worth the effort of looking. She reached down and picked up another pebble from the basin floor, a small white stone worn perfectly smooth by the water's endless passage. She turned it over in her palm, feeling its weight, its coolness, its simple perfection. Then she added it to the row. Hector Pruitt came by one evening in the last week of July, walking up the slope alone, while the sun was still above the mountains. Thea saw him coming and went to meet him, curious about the purpose of his visit. He stopped at the edge of the property and took off his hat, holding it in his hands with an air of formality that seemed out of place for a casual call. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I wanted to speak with you." "About what?" "About the basin. About what you found there." He paused, searching for words. "I have been thinking about it ever since that first day when Silas showed it to me. Thinking about what it means." "What does it mean to you?" Hector looked at the granite ridge rising behind the cabin, at the rock face that hid the entrance to the chamber. "It means that I have lived in this valley for 11 years, and I thought I understood it. I thought I knew what was here, and what was possible, and what the land could give. And I was wrong. You were not wrong about your own land. your wheat grows well. Your family prospers. That is not what I mean." He turned back to face her, his weathered face serious. "I mean that I stopped looking. Years ago, I stopped paying attention to anything that did not fit what I already believed. The land was this way and not that way. Some ground was good and some ground was poor. Some things were possible and some things were not." He shook his head slowly. "And then you came along and found a hidden world inside a rock I have walked past 100 times without giving it a second thought. Anyone could have found it, but no one did. Not in all the years people have lived in this valley. No one ever thought to press their hand against the stone and feel what was there." He paused, looking at her with something like respect. "You did something the rest of us forgot how to do. You looked at the world as if it might still contain surprises." Thea was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "I was 62 years old when I came here," she said, finally. "I had buried 2 children and a husband. I had sold the only home I ever knew and traveled 1,000 miles to marry a man I had never met. I thought my life was mostly over, that all the important things had already happened, that whatever years I had left would be quiet and predictable and unremarkable. And instead I found a crack in a wall." She smiled slightly. "And I learned that I was wrong about everything I thought I knew." Hector put his hat back on and nodded slowly. "That is what I came to say, Mrs. Calloway, that you have reminded me of something I had forgotten. That the world is bigger than we think and that it is worth paying attention to the things we walk past without seeing." He turned and walked back down the slope toward his own property, and Thea watched him go, thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Montana expecting nothing, hoping for nothing, simply looking for a place to spend her remaining years in useful labor and quiet companionship. And she had found something extraordinary. Not just the basin, though the basin was extraordinary. Not just the garden or the warm water or the constant temperature that made impossible things possible. She had found a new understanding of herself, of what she was capable of what the world could offer to anyone willing to look beyond the obvious. 64 years old, and she was just beginning to see. The evening of July 31st was warm, and still the heat of the day lingering into the twilight hours. Thea sat in the basin as the light from the fissures faded from gold to amber, to the soft gray that preceded darkness. She had a candle beside her unlit, ready to illuminate the chamber when the last of the daylight disappeared. Silas was in the passage. She could hear him moving, the sound of his footsteps on the stone floor. A comfortable rhythm she had come to know as well as her own heartbeat. Prue was somewhere above in the cabin, singing softly to herself as she finished the work of the day. Thomas was asleep in the nook, his leg having troubled him enough that rest was more valuable than activity. The garden stretched along the eastern wall, a dark mass of green in the fading light. The tomato plants were still barren, though the first flush of fruit had been picked and eaten, and the second flush was just beginning to swell. The herbs were fragrant and full, ready for harvest. The onions and radishes and lettuce had all been eaten and replanted and eaten again, a continuous cycle of growth and renewal that seemed almost miraculous in its consistency. Thea reached down and touched the surface of the stone pool, feeling the warmth of the water against her fingertips. The seep ran its endless, quiet song water moving over rock in a pattern that had been repeating since before human memory, and would continue long after she was gone. She thought about time, about the years she had lived and the years that remained, about the unexpected turns that had brought her to this place and this moment, about the way life surprised you, even when you thought you were too old for surprises. She had been a practical woman all her life. She still was. She had no illusions about the challenges ahead, about the hard work still to be done, about the uncertainties that accompanied every venture into unknown territory. The basin was a gift, but it was not a guarantee. The garden would require constant attention. The legal victory over Croft, while decisive, might not be the end of challenges from those who envied what they had found. But she was not afraid. She had walked past cracks in walls for 64 years, assuming there was nothing inside worth finding. She had accepted the limits others placed on her, the boundaries that seemed fixed and permanent, the definitions of what was possible and what was not. She had been practical to the point of blindness, so focused on the expected that she could not see the extraordinary. Branuri. And then she had pressed her hand against warm stone and felt the breath of the mountain. Everything had changed in that moment. Not the circumstances of her life, which were the same as they had always been, but her understanding of what those circumstances could mean. The crack in the wall had not created possibilities that did not exist before. It had simply revealed possibilities that had been there all along, hidden, waiting for someone patient enough to find them. That was the lesson she would carry with her for whatever years remained. Not that the world was secretly wonderful, though sometimes it was. Not that hard work always paid off, though sometimes it did. But that the limits we accept are often limits of vision, not reality. That the things we call impossible are often merely untried. That the cracks in the walls of our assumptions are worth exploring even when, especially when, everyone else walks past without looking. She lit the candle as the last light faded from the fissures above. The small flame cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, illuminating the chamber she had come to love more than any place she had ever lived. From the passage, she heard Silas approaching. She heard his footsteps slow as he emerged into the basin. Heard him pause to look around, the way he always did, as if seeing the space for the first time. "Thea," he said. "Here." He came to sit beside her at the edge of the pool, lowering himself carefully onto the stone. His joints troubled him more these days, the years of hard labor taking their toll. But he did not complain. He never complained. They sat together in the candlelight, listening to the seep, feeling the warmth of the stone beneath them. "It is almost August," Silas said. "Yes. A year ago, we did not know this place existed. No. And now it is home." Thea looked around the basin at the garden and the shelves and the sleeping nook, at the columns of spent daylight that would refill with gold come morning. Home. Yes. It was home. "You know what Hector Pruitt said to me once," she said, "back in the winter when he first saw this place. What did he say? He said, 'Lord Almighty Silas.' That was all. Just those 3 words. And then he stood there for 4 minutes without saying anything else." Silas chuckled softly. "That sounds like Hector." It was the most eloquent thing I have ever heard him say. They were quiet for a while, sitting together in the warm darkness, two people who had found each other late in life, and then found something unexpected together. "Thea," Silas said finally. "Yes, I am glad you came to Montana." She reached over and took his hand, feeling the roughness of his palm, the strength still in his fingers despite his years. "So am I. And I am glad you found this place. We found it together." "No." He shook his head slowly. "I would have walked past that crack every day for the rest of my life, without ever thinking to look inside. You found it, Thea. You saw what the rest of us missed, and you had the courage to go inside when any sensible person would have stayed out." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She simply held his hand and watched the candle flame dance, and listened to the seep, and thought about all the things she had found in her 64 years, and all the things she had yet to find. The basin was quiet around them. The stone was warm. The water ran its endless course. And somewhere above beyond the fissures in the ceiling, the stars were coming out over Granite Pass. The same stars that had shone on this mountain for millions of years. The same stars that would shine for millions more. Everything just now was exactly enough. Thea added one more pebble to the row. The morning of August 1st dawned clear and bright. The heat wave broken at last by a storm that had rolled through in the night. The air was fresh and clean, and the mountains stood sharp against a sky of impossible blue. Thea woke early as she always did and made her way through the passage to the outside world. She stood at the entrance and breathed in the morning air, feeling the coolness of it against her face. The contrast with the warm embrace of the basin she had just left. The shelf of land stretched before her. The same ground she had walked every day for 3 years. The cabin sat solid and square against the backdrop of the granite ridge. The creek ran full again after the night's rain, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear a bird singing its first song of the day. She thought about the woman she had been when she arrived here. Practical, reserved, accepting of limitations, expecting nothing. She thought about the woman she had become, still practical, still reserved in many ways, but no longer accepting of limitations, no longer expecting nothing. The crack in the wall had changed her, not in dramatic ways that anyone else would notice, but in ways that mattered. She looked at the world differently now. She paid attention to things she would have ignored before. She asked questions she would never have thought to ask. She was 64 years old, and she was still learning. That was perhaps the greatest gift of all. Not the basin, though the basin was extraordinary. Not the garden or the warm water or the security of knowing they would survive the winters to come. But the understanding that learning never stopped, that growth was possible at any age, that the world would keep revealing new wonders to anyone patient enough to look. She walked back into the cabin to start the coffee and found Prue already there, standing at the stove, with a pot in her hand. "You are up early," Thea said. "I could not sleep. Too much to think about." "About what?" Prue set the pot on the stove and turned to face her mother-in-law. "About the future. About what we are building here. About what comes next." "What do you think comes next?" "I do not know. That is what keeps me awake." Prue paused, choosing her words carefully. A year ago, we were barely getting by. Now we have the basin and the garden and the legal claim that says it is all ours. Everything has changed, and I keep wondering what we do with it. Thea sat down at the table and looked at the young woman she had come to love as a daughter. What do you want to do with it? I want to make it matter. I want all of this, everything we have found and built and fought for, to mean something more than just our own comfort. I want it to be the start of something. The start of what? Prue did not answer immediately. She poured coffee into 2 cups and brought them to the table, sitting across from Thea with her hands wrapped around the warm ceramic. I do not know yet, she said finally. But I know it is possible. This place proves that things we thought were impossible are not impossible at all. And if that is true here in this basin, maybe it is true in other ways too. Maybe there are other cracks in other walls waiting for someone to find them. Thea looked at her and smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real, the expression of a woman who recognized something of herself in the younger generation. You are right, she said. There are always more cracks, always more possibilities. The question is whether we have the courage to look for them. Do we? We found this one, did we not? Prue smiled back, and for a moment the years between them seemed to dissolve, and they were simply 2 women sitting together in the morning light, dreaming of what might be. To the cracks in the walls, Prue said, raising her coffee cup. To the courage to look inside, Thea replied. They touched cups and drank, and outside the cabin the sun rose higher over Granite Pass, and the day began. In the basin below, the seep ran its endless course. The stone held its warmth. The garden grew in the filtered light, green and alive and full of promise. And on the edge of the pool, a row of white pebbles waited smooth and pale, each one found and placed by patient hands. One more pebble, then another, then another. The collection would never be complete. There would always be more to find, more to discover, more to add to the growing pattern. That was the nature of things worth doing. They were never finished. They simply continued, one step at a time, one discovery at a time, one patient moment of attention at a time. Dorothea Calloway had learned that lesson late in life, but she had learned it well, and she was not done finding things yet.